"She's pure. I'm ruined," the girl cried, and the mountain man answered, "Both are perfect." Snow beats against a lonely cabin when a cast-out young woman stumbles to the door. Shamed by lies and stripped of her home, the rugged mountain man inside, broken by war and grief, takes her in against the whispers of the town and the warnings of the preacher. But just as mercy sparks between them, a darker storm rises, a greedy stepfather thirsting for land, railroad agent bent on seizing the valley, and a secret deed signed years ago that could save everything or condemn them both. As church bells toll and jail keys rattle, will the truth set them free or destroy what little hope they've found? Before we dive in, drop your name or city in the comments. It reminds me that behind every view is a real heartbeat. The mountain wind howled against the cabin walls like a hungry wolf. Sarah Beth huddled closer to the crackling fire, her borrowed clothes hanging loose on her thin frame. Steam rose from the tin cup of beans Caleb had given her, but she barely touched them. Her shoulders trembled with each sob. "She's pure. I'm ruined." The words burst from her like a dam breaking. Her fingers clutched the rough wool blanket around her shoulders. "My stepfather," he told everyone in town, her voice cracked, "said things about me, terrible things that weren't true." Caleb stood by the hearth, his weathered face half hidden in shadow. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, marking the years that had carved lines around his eyes. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize truth in a stranger's eyes. Sarah Beth's tears fell faster. "My mama raised me right before she passed. Taught me about dignity and virtue." Her fingers worried at the frayed edge of the blanket. "But now, everyone believes his lies. Even the church ladies who've known me since I was knee-high turn their backs." Caleb moved slowly, deliberately, like approaching a spooked horse. He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair, his joints creaking from years of hard work. "Both are perfect," he said, his voice rough but gentle as creek water over stones. Sarah Beth's weeping quieted. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, confusion clear on her face. "Your mom is teaching," he explained, "and you, both perfect in the Lord's sight." He spoke the words with quiet certainty, though his own heart ached with memories of battlefield, choices that still haunted his dreams. Rising stiffly, Caleb crossed to an old trunk in the corner. The hinges groaned as he lifted the lid, revealing carefully folded clothing. He withdrew a simple dress and shawl, holding them out to her. "My Rebecca's," he said softly. "Been packed away these 3 years since the fever took her. Reckon she'd want them used." Sarah Beth touched the fabric reverently. "I couldn't possibly. You can, and you will." Caleb's tone was firm but kind. "Can't have you catching your death in those wet things?" He gestured to a rough partition in the corner. "Change there. I'll tend the beans." While Sarah Beth changed, Caleb stirred the pot hanging over the fire, listening to the storm's fury. The shutters rattled against the cabin walls, and snow whispered against the window glass. His thoughts turned to Rebecca, wondering what she'd make of this situation. She'd always had a way of seeing God's hand in life's strange turns. Beth emerged from behind the partition, Rebecca's old dress hanging a bit loose but warm and dry. She moved carefully back to her chair by the fire, as if unsure of her welcome despite Caleb's kindness. Caleb filled 2 tin bowls with beans and cornbread. Setting one before Sarah Beth, they ate in silence, broken only by the snap of burning wood and the howl of wind. The quiet wasn't entirely comfortable, but it held no judgment either, as he watched her from the corner of his eye. Caleb wondered if this might be some kind of test from above. Here he sat, a man who'd turned his back on duty and brotherhood during the war, offering shelter to a girl the town had turned its back on. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah Beth's spoon scraped the bottom of her bowl. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steadier now. "I truly had nowhere else to go." Caleb nodded, understanding well how it felt to be cut off from everything familiar. "Storms set in proper now," he said, rising to add another log to the fire. "You'll stay tonight, at least. Tomorrow we can figure what comes next." The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as they fell back into silence. Outside, the Colorado winter raged on, but inside this humble shelter, 2 wounded souls had found a moment's peace. Whether it was providence or chance that had brought Sarah Beth to his door, Caleb couldn't say. But as he watched her slowly relax by his hearth, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Dawn's first light painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Caleb stirred from his makeshift bed near the banked fire. The floorboards creaked softly as he sat up. Immediately alert to unfamiliar sounds in his usually silent home, Sarah Beth stood at the hearth, her borrowed dress catching the pale morning light as she wielded his old broom with careful strokes. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the window. She paused when she noticed him watching, her cheeks coloring. "Hope you don't mind," she said softly. "Wanted to make myself useful after your kindness." Caleb pushed himself to his feet, joints stiff from the cold. No need to earn your keep just yet. He moved to stoke the fire, adding fresh kindling to the glowing embers. Sarah Beth set the broom aside, twisting her hands in her apron. About that, she took a deep breath. "I was wondering if I might stay a spell, just until I can find honest work somewhere." Her eyes met his, determined, despite their worry. "I won't be a burden." Caleb studied her for a long moment. The town would talk, no doubt about that. Folks already gave him a wide berth, the strange mountain man who kept to himself. Having a young woman in his home would set tongues wagging something fierce. "Reckon you can stay," he said finally, "but there'll be talk." "There's already talk," she replied, a flash of bitterness in her voice. "At least here, it's honest work and clean air." They settled into the morning's chores without further discussion. Caleb showed her where he kept the water buckets, and together they made their way to the creek that ran behind the cabin. The fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked the well-worn path. "Watch the ice," Caleb warned, steadying her arm as she navigated the slippery rocks. They worked in companionable silence, breaking through the thin layer of ice to fill their buckets. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Caleb led Sarah Beth to the small barn where his goats were penned. The animals crowded around them, bleating. For attention and feed, Sarah Beth laughed as one particularly bold nanny butted against her skirts. "They're characters, ain't they?" She scratched behind the goat's ears. "My mama kept goats too." Before, her voice trailed off. Caleb paused. In his work, waiting, "Our land wasn't far from here," she continued, her voice soft with memory. "Up past Miller's Creek, where the aspens grow thick. Mama's family held it 3 generations. She scattered feed for the goats, her movements precise and practiced. After she passed, my stepfather sold it right quick. Said a woman's claim wasn't worth the paper it was written on." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice neutral. "That wasn't right." "No," Sarah Beth agreed quietly. "It wasn't." They spent the afternoon chopping kindling, Sarah Beth proving herself handy with the smaller pieces, while Caleb tackled the larger logs. As the sun began to set, they returned to the cabin's warmth. Caleb worked at his table, slicing fresh cornbread while Sarah Beth tidied away the day's tools. Almost without seeming to realize it, she began to hum as she worked. The melody, sweet and clear, filled the cabin's simple space. Caleb's knife stilled mid-cut. The hymn wrapped around him like a familiar embrace, carrying him back to Sunday. Mornings, when Rebecca's voice had filled their home with the same tune, his chest tightened with the memory. Sarah Beth noticed his frozen posture and fell silent. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know some folks don't care for singing in their home." "No," Caleb managed, his voice rough. "It's fine, thank you." He couldn't bring himself to explain why that particular hymn had struck him so deeply, how it had been Rebecca's favorite, how she'd sung it even in her fever dreams near the end. "I'll keep my singing to the barn chores if you prefer," Sarah Beth offered, misreading his reaction. "The goats don't seem to mind it." Caleb shook his head, finally finding his voice again. "Sing when you've a mind to music. It belongs in a home." They shared the cornbread in quiet reflection, each lost in their own thoughts. Caleb found himself studying his unexpected guest with new eyes. When she'd first collapsed at his door, he'd seen only a burden, a test of his Christian charity. Now, watching her brush crumbs from her borrowed dress, he saw something more, a reminder that mercy, like music, could fill empty spaces with unexpected grace. The hymn's echo lingered in his mind, bridging past and present with its sweet refrain. Perhaps, he thought, this was more than just offering shelter to a stranger. Perhaps it was a chance to remember that even in the hardest times, hope could arrive on a melody's wings. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the mountain air sharp with winter's bite. Caleb stood in his barn, carefully hitching his old mule to the wagon while Sarah Beth waited nearby, wrapped in a borrowed wool shawl that had once belonged to his wife. The fabric hung loose on her smaller frame, but it was warm and clean, if a bit faded. "You certain about this?" Caleb asked, adjusting the harness straps. "Ain't nobody would fault you for staying back." Sarah Beth lifted her chin. "I won't hide from God or man," she said firmly. "Besides, my mama always said missing church was like missing a meal for your soul." The wagon creaked as they set out, wooden wheels crunching through fresh snow. The little mountain hamlet's church sat nestled among tall pines, its whitewashed walls bright against the evergreen backdrop. As they approached, Caleb noticed several heads turn their way, and the murmuring began. Mrs. Peterson clutched her husband's arm, whispering behind her gloved hand. The Cooper boys, usually rambunctious, fell silent as the wagon passed. Caleb helped Sarah Beth down, keeping his movements deliberate and dignified despite the stares. He recognized the look in people's eyes. They'd heard the accusations her stepfather had spread. Inside the one-room church, the rough-hewn pews were already filling with familiar faces. Caleb and Sarah Beth took seats near the back, but there was no hiding from the sideways glances and not-so-subtle turning of heads. The morning sun streamed through simple glass windows, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Reverend Harlan stood at his pulpit, his stern gaze sweeping across the congregation. The preacher's voice rang out clear and sharp as he began his sermon, each word striking like a hammer on anvil. "Today, we speak of sin," he declared, his knuckles white against the pulpit's edge, "of those who would lead others astray, and of men who, in their weakness, offer shelter to fallen women." Caleb's shoulders stiffened. Beside him, Sarah Beth sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but he could see the trembling in her fingers. The Reverend continued his fierce denouncement of moral failings, his words cutting through the hushed sanctuary. As the sermon drew to its close, Reverend Harlan called for the final hymn. The congregation rose, reaching for their worn hymnals, and then, clear as a mountain stream, Sarah Beth's voice rose above the shuffling of pages. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! The pure notes filled every corner of the small church. People froze, hymnals half opened as her voice soared through the familiar verses. This was no ordinary singing. This was the kind of music that reminded weather-beaten farmers and tired mothers what heaven might sound like. "Was blind, but now I see." Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Mr. Thompson, who hadn't shown emotion since his wife's passing 3 years before, cleared his throat roughly and looked away. Even Reverend Harlan stood silent, his stern expression softening almost despite itself when the last note faded away. The silence held for several heartbeats before the congregation stirred back to life. As people filed out into the cold morning air, something had shifted. Instead of avoiding them, several townspeople approached Sarah Beth hesitantly. "That was surely something special," Mrs. Cooper said, her usual sharpness replaced with wonder. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" "My mama taught me," Sarah Beth replied softly. "She said music was God's way of helping us remember His love." More folks gathered around, asking about her mother, about the hymns she knew. Caleb stayed, close, watching carefully for any sign of cruelty, but he saw only genuine interest in their faces. Even so, he kept his position beside her, a quiet guardian against any potential unkindness. The ride home was peaceful, their wagon cutting through fresh snow beneath the towering pines. Sarah Beth sat quietly for a while, lost in thought, before speaking. "I felt something today," she said finally. "In that church, singing those words, it was like God was telling me He hasn't forgotten me, after all." Caleb clicked softly to the mule, considering her words. He thought about how she'd appeared that snowy night, desperate and alone. Thought about the way her voice had transformed the church this morning, turning judgment to wonder. Perhaps, he reflected, there was more to her arrival than mere chance. Maybe the Lord did work in mysterious ways, sending not just a stranger to his door, but a reminder that grace could appear in the most unexpected forms. He kept these thoughts to himself, But as they continued their journey home through the snowy forest, something warm and hopeful had taken root in his heart, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. 2 days after the church gathering, the morning sun cast long shadows across Caleb's valley. He and Sarah Beth worked side by side mending a broken fence line, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Sarah Beth held the wooden posts steady, while Caleb drove them deeper into the frozen ground with practiced swings of his maul. "These posts should hold through spring thaw," Caleb said, pausing to wipe his brow. The work was hard, but necessary. Good fences meant safe goats. Sarah Beth nodded, adjusting her grip on the post. "I reckon they will." "Your land here, it's something special, Caleb. The way the valley cradles everything, like God's own hands, shaped it." Before Caleb could respond, the sharp sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. A rider approached from the eastern trail, his dark coat and polished boots marking him as a city man. The stranger sat tall in an expensive leather saddle. Surveying the land with calculating eyes, Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah Beth. The rider reined his horse to a stop, removing his hat with a flourish. That seemed more mockery than courtesy. "Mr. McCrae," the man said, his voice smooth as creek ice. "Julius Morton, Denver, and Rio Grande Railroad. I trust you've heard we're expanding through these parts." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Heard tell of it. Railroad's got no business in this valley, though." Morton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "On the contrary, our surveys show this valley provides the most efficient route for the Denver line. Unless you can present proper proof of your homestead claim, I'm afraid this land will be subject to seizure under eminent domain." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. His homestead papers had burned years ago when lightning struck his first cabin. He'd never bothered replacing them, thinking his isolation would protect him from such threats. "This here's my land," Caleb said firmly. "Built every fence post and barn board myself. 7 years of work." Morton's smile widened as he noted Caleb's reaction. But sentiment doesn't hold up in court, my friend." Without documentation, he paused, adjusting his leather gloves. "Though you might consider selling now. We could offer a modest sum, better than nothing, which is what you'll get once the courts rule." Sarah Beth stepped forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "You can't just steal a man's home, my dear girl," Morton said, not bothering to hide his condescension. "Progress waits for no one. The railroad brings civilization, prosperity. Surely you understand that's worth more than one man's stubborn attachment to a piece of wild land." "Off my property," Caleb growled, his hand tightening on the maul's handle. Morton shrugged, replacing his hat. "Think about my offer, Mr. McCrae. It won't last long." He turned his horse, then called over his shoulder. "The line is coming, whether you like it or not." They watched him ride away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the winter air. Caleb stood rigid, his face carved from stone, until the rider disappeared from view. That evening, after a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, Sarah Beth broke the heavy silence that had settled over the cabin. "We can fight this," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "There must be witnesses who know how long you've worked this land. The Reverend, the townspeople." "Ain't that simple," Caleb interrupted, staring into the fireplace. "Law wants paper proof. Besides, most forecastle side with the railroad means money, jobs." "Then we'll find another way," Sarah Beth insisted. She moved to sit closer to him, her eyes bright with determination. "This land, this home you've built, it matters. Not just to you." Caleb turned to look at her, his expression haunted. "Since the war," he said slowly, "since Mary died, this valley's been more than land to me. It's been my refuge, my chance, too, to make peace with everything." He drew a shaky breath. "Losing it ain't just about the property. It's about losing the only place I've felt right with God since I deserted my unit." Sarah Beth listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she spoke softly, but with certainty. "Your solitude here, the peace you found, it's already done more good than you know." She met his gaze steadily. "It gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Showed me there's still kindness in the world, still hope." She reached out and touched his weathered hand. "We'll find a way to save it, I promise." Caleb looked down at her small hand resting on his, remembering how she'd appeared that snowy night, desperate and alone. Now here she sat, offering him the same kind of refuge he'd given her. The firelight flickered across their faces as the weight of the day's threat hung in the air. Between them, the Wednesday morning sun glinted off patches of melting snow as Caleb's wagon rattled down the mountain trail toward town. Sarah Beth sat beside him on the rough wooden seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. They needed supplies, flour, salt, and lamp oil, but Caleb could sense her tension growing with each mile closer to civilization. The trading post's weathered sign creaked in the cool breeze as Caleb helped Sarah Beth down from the wagon. A few townspeople milled about the boardwalk, their curious gazes following the pair as they entered the mercantile. The bell above the door chimed softly as they stepped inside. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, nodded politely, though his eyes held questions. Sarah Beth moved quietly through the aisles, gathering their needed items while Caleb discussed feed prices near the counter. The peaceful routine shattered when the door burst open with a bang. Amos Ridge stumbled in, his face flushed and his eyes wild with whiskey and fury. The stench of cheap spirits rolled off him in waves. He spotted Sarah Beth near the dry goods and jabbed an accusatory finger in her direction. "There's my wayward stepdaughter," he bellowed, causing several customers to turn and stare. "Living in sin with a mountain hermit ain't that rich." Sarah Beth froze, her face draining of color. Caleb moved deliberately to stand between them, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Ridge, you're drunk. Best head home and sleep it off." Amos sneered, swaying slightly. "Don't you lecture me, McCrae. Taking advantage of a fallen woman, that's what you're doing." His voice grew louder, playing to his audience. "First, she shames her poor dead mama's memory. Now she's holed up in your cabin like some... That's enough." Caleb's quiet words cut through Amos's tirade like a knife. "Every word you've spoken is false, and you know it." The mercantile had grown deathly quiet. Sarah Beth trembled but held her ground, chin lifted despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Several women whispered behind raised hands while the men studied their boots uncomfortably. "False, is it?" Amos lurched forward, pointing at Sarah Beth again. "Then why'd she run away? Why's she hiding up in your mountain instead of facing what's she done?" The jangle of spurs announced Sheriff Harlow's arrival. The lawman's weathered face took in the scene with experienced eyes. "Everything all right here, folks?" Sheriff Amos whirled unsteadily. "This man's harboring my stepdaughter against her will." "I demand you'll demand nothing, Amos Sheriff," Harlow interrupted firmly. "Miss Ridge is of age, and I don't see any chains holding her." He stepped closer, his voice hardening. "Now, you've had enough excitement for one day. Either head home peaceful-like, or spend the night in my jail sobering. Up, your choice." Amos glared at them all, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, the air crackled with tension. Then he spat on the floor and stormed out. Shouldering roughly past a startled customer in the doorway, the sheriff tipped his hat to Sarah Beth. "Ma'am, Mr. McCrae." With that, he followed Amos outside to ensure he actually left. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll just wrap up these supplies for you folks." Outside, beside the wagon, Sarah Beth finally broke down. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she pressed her hands to her face. "I'm so sorry, Caleb. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Caleb touched her shoulder gently. "Truth will stand longer than slander, Miss Sarah Beth. Remember that?" They loaded the supplies in heavy silence. But halfway up the mountain trail, Sarah Beth spoke again, her voice stronger despite its tremor. "There's something you should know," she said, twisting her hands in her lap. "Amos, he's not just spreading lies about me. He's after my mother's land." She took a shaky breath. "Before Mama died, she left me her property rights. It's good land, with water rights and timber. Amos married her for it, but he couldn't touch it without my signature once I came of age." Her voice hardened. "He squandered everything else he'd get his hands on. Now he wants me back under his control so he can sell it all." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins as understanding dawned. "The railroad," he said quietly. Sarah Beth nodded. "I reckon so. That surveyor who visited, he probably talked to Amos first." She turned to face Caleb, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My mama's land borders yours to the east. If Amos sells to the railroad, the implications hung heavy in the mountain air." Caleb guided the wagon carefully around a bend, his mind churning with this new information. The railroad's threat to his own land suddenly seemed part of a larger scheme, one that had already caused Sarah Beth so much pain. They continued their journey home in thoughtful silence, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines. Both knew their separate struggles had just become inexorably intertwined. Though neither spoke it aloud, dawn brought heavy clouds and bitter winds whistling through the valley. By mid-morning, thick snowflakes swirled down from a slate gray sky, coating the landscape in fresh white. Caleb stood at his cabin window, frowning at the creek that served as their water source. Ice had crept further along its banks overnight. "We'd best get water while we still can," he said, reaching for his heavy coat, creeks starting to freeze solid. Sarah Beth was already pulling on her borrowed boots. "I'll help," she said firmly, wrapping herself in an old wool shawl. Caleb hesitated. "It's bitter work, Miss Sarah Beth. No shame in staying by the fire." She shook her head, determination bright in her eyes. "I won't sit idle while you struggle alone. Besides, 2 pairs of hands work faster than one." The wind bit sharp as they trudged through deepening snow to the creek. Their breath came in white puffs as Caleb showed Sarah Beth how to break through the surface ice with the back of his axe. Together they chopped carefully, making holes large enough to dip their buckets. "Mind the edges," Caleb warned, steadying her arm as she leaned forward. "Ice can be treacherous." Sarah Beth nodded, her cheeks pink with cold and effort as she filled her bucket. The icy water sloshed against the metal sides, some splashing onto her skirts. She didn't complain, just adjusted her grip and kept working. They made 3 trips, back and forth, storing water in every available container. By the time they finished, snow had soaked through their clothes. But Sarah Beth's eyes shone with quiet pride at their accomplishment. Inside the cabin, they hung their wet things by the fire. While Caleb stoked the flames higher, Sarah Beth disappeared briefly to her small corner of the cabin. She returned, holding something close to her chest, hesitation clear in her stance. "Mr. McCrae," she said softly, "there's something I need to show you." She moved closer to the fire's light and carefully unfolded a weathered piece of paper. "I've been keeping this safe, hidden in my satchel. It's the deed to my mother's land." Caleb took the document with careful hands, moving near the window. To read in the gray daylight, his eyes widened as he studied the carefully penned description of property boundaries. "This land," he said slowly, "it borders my valley to the east." Sarah Beth nodded. "Yes, Mother was so proud of it. She made sure I understood every word on that paper before she passed." She twisted her hands together. "I've been afraid to show anyone, worried Amos might find out I had it. But after yesterday, seeing how the railroad threatens your home," she met his gaze steadily, "I think maybe this could help us both." Caleb spread the deed carefully on his small table, tracing the property lines with one rough finger. Together, these lands would block the railroad's path through the valley, he said, wonder creeping into his voice. "They'd have to find another route entirely." "Then you think it might work?" Hope brightened Sarah Beth's face. "We could stop them." Caleb's expression sobered. "Maybe, but a deed this old needs witnesses to stand up against railroad lawyers. Someone who saw your mother sign it, who can swear to its truth." Sarah Beth's shoulders slumped slightly, but then she straightened, her eyes lighting with sudden memory. "There was someone," she said, "a Comanche trader called Lone Hawk. He did business with my family for years, even after Mother died. He was there the day she signed this deed. She trusted him to be honest." Lone Hawk. Caleb rubbed his jaw. "Thoughtfully, I know of him. He still trades through these parts sometimes, mostly north of here." "He would remember," Sarah Beth insisted. "Mother always said he had a mind like a steel trap for business dealings. If we could find him. Caleb studied the deed again, then carefully folded it and handed it back to Sarah Beth. "I'll find him," he said firmly. "Soon as this snow lets up enough for safe travel, I'll start asking around the trading posts. Someone will know where he winters." Sarah Beth clutched the deed close, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You'd do that? Even after all the trouble I've brought?" "You've brought no trouble that wasn't already heading my way," Caleb said quietly. "And you've shown more courage than most in facing it." He glanced out the window at the falling snow. "We'll fight this together, Miss Sarah Beth. Your mother's land and mine. Maybe that's how it was meant to be. The fire crackled warmly as Sarah Beth carefully tucked the precious deed away in her satchel. Outside, snow continued to blanket the valley, but inside the cabin, hope had kindled like a fresh flame dot. Dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as Caleb readied his horse for the journey. He'd packed light but essential dried meat, extra blankets, and matches wrapped tight in oilcloth. The morning air bit sharp and clean, his breath frosting in white clouds as he checked the saddle straps. Sarah Beth hurried from the cabin, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I made corn cakes for your ride," she said, tucking them into his saddlebag. Her eyes betrayed her worry. "Let me come with you. Two seeking might find Lone Hawk faster than one." Caleb shook his head, gesturing at the crystalline landscape. These mountain passes turned deadly quick. Snows fresh and deep one wrong step could mean a broken leg. He softened his tone at her crestfallen expression. "The cabin needs tending. Goats won't milk themselves." "I know," Sarah Beth wrapped her shawl tighter, "but please be careful. These mountains aren't forgiving in winter." "I've weathered worse," Caleb assured her, though memories of bitter war campaigns flickered unbidden through his mind. He mounted carefully, settling into the creaking leather saddle. "Keep the fire stoked. I'll return soon as I can." Sarah Beth stepped back, hugging herself against the cold. "God, go with you," she called softly as he rode away. Caleb guided his horse through deepening snow, following game trails that wound up into the ridges. The silence pressed around him, broken only by his mount's labored breathing and the soft crunch of hooves breaking through ice crust. As the sun climbed higher, his thoughts wandered to darker days' cannon smoke and screaming horses. The weight of his rifle as he'd fled the battlefield, his wife's face when he'd finally made it home, not with honor, but with shame. "Lord," he whispered, his words lost in the vast whiteness. She never stopped praying for my soul, even after. The memory of Elizabeth's gentle faith stung sharper than the winter wind. She'd believed in redemption until the fever took her by midday. Caleb had crossed 2 frozen streams and skirted a treacherous scree slope. He paused to rest his horse in a sheltered hollow, sharing some of Sarah Beth's corn cakes. The sun was already sliding toward the western peaks when he spotted smoke rising from a protected valley, thin blue wisps almost lost against the pale sky. Approaching carefully, he made out several winter lodges tucked against a cliff face. 2 children playing in the snow spotted him first, running to alert the camp. A tall figure emerged from the nearest lodge, watching his approach with measured calm. Caleb recognized Lone Hawk immediately, though years had threaded silver through the Comanche trader's dark hair. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I come seeking truth," he called out in greeting. Lone Hawk's weathered face remained impassive, but he gestured welcome. Truth is good medicine in cold times. His English was clear, though carefully chosen. "What brings you to our winter camp, Caleb McRae?" Caleb explained Sarah Beth's situation, her mother's land, the hidden deed, Amos Regis, greed, and the railroad's threats. Lone Hawk listened without interruption, only the slight narrowing of his eyes betraying recognition at certain details. "I remember this woman's mother," he said finally. "She traded fair, spoke straight. The paper signing, yes, I was there." He made a gesture that encompassed the surrounding peaks. "Land holds memory longer than men. Railroad men forget this." "Would you speak this truth in town?" Caleb asked. "Your word could save both her land and mine." Lone Hawk studied him for a long moment. "You shelter this woman now?" "She needed help," Caleb said simply. "Seems maybe we both did. A ghost of—" A smile touched Lone Hawk's face. Sometimes the Great Spirit sends help wearing strange clothes. He nodded slowly. "I will come when you need my words. Truth must stand against lies, or all treaties become wind." Relief flooded through Caleb. He reached into his saddlebag, producing coffee and tobacco he'd brought as trading goods. "For your kindness," he said, offering them. Lone Hawk accepted with dignity. "Stay and share our fire," he invited. "Night comes quick, and the trail is treacherous in darkness." But Caleb thought of Sarah Beth alone at the cabin. "Much obliged. But I should start back. She worry." Understanding flickered in Lone Hawk's dark eyes. He gripped Caleb's arm briefly. "Travel safe then. When you need me, send word to Trading Post Creek. I will come." The sun was touching the western peaks as Caleb mounted up. Looking back, he saw Lone Hawk, still watching, a steady presence against the gathering dusk. The journey home would be cold and long. But hope rode with him now, hope built on honor and truth that crossed the boundaries between their worlds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow. When Caleb's horse finally trudged up the path to the cabin, his muscles ached from the cold journey, but warmth bloomed in his chest at the sight of smoke curling from the chimney. Sarah Beth must have kept the fire well fed, just as she'd promised. Before he could dismount, the cabin door flew open. Sarah Beth hurried out, wrapping her shawl against the chill. "Thank heaven you're back safe," she called, relief clear in her voice. "I've been watching the pass since morning." Caleb's stiff fingers fumbled with the reins as he climbed down. "Horse needs tending first," he said, though gratitude for her concern warmed him more than any fire could. "I'll help," she offered, already moving to unfasten his saddlebags. "Then you must come in and eat. Mrs. Peterson from the valley brought venison yesterday, traded some of our goat cheese for it. The stew's been simmering all afternoon." Together they cared for his mount, working in comfortable silence as the sun dipped lower. Inside the barn, Sarah Beth's quiet efficiency matched his own, as if they'd done this dance 100 times before. When the horse was finally rubbed down and settled with fresh hay, they made their way to the cabin. The interior glowed with firelight, and rich, savory scents filled the air. Sarah Beth had kept it neat as a pin, he noticed, with fresh pine boughs on the mantel lending their sweet scent to the warmth. His throat tightened at the simple comfort of coming home to such care. "Sit," she insisted, guiding him to his chair by the hearth. "You must be frozen through." She ladled generous portions of stew into tin bowls, adding thick slices of fresh bread alongside. Caleb's first bite drew an appreciative grunt. "Been a long spell since I've had cooking like this," he admitted. Sarah Beth settled in her own chair, smoothing her skirts. "Did you find him?" she asked softly. "Lone Hawk, I did." Caleb nodded, sharing the details of his meeting with the Comanche trader. "He remembered your mother, clear as day. Said he'll testify when needed." Tears welled in Sarah Beth's eyes. "Then there's hope," she whispered. "For both our lands." The fire crackled in comfortable silence as they ate. Outside, snow began to fall in lazy spirals, adding to the sense of peace within the cabin's walls. But something in Sarah Beth's expression seemed troubled. "What's weighing on you?" Caleb asked gently. She set her bowl aside, twisting her hands in her lap. "Even with the deed proved true, some folks will never see past what Amos said about me. A ruined woman has no place in decent society. Folks said plenty about me, too. When I came back from the war," Caleb replied, his voice rough with memory. "Deserter, coward. Reckon they weren't wrong, neither. Running from battle ain't something a man forgets." Sarah Beth's eyes met his, full of understanding rather than judgment. "You've shown more courage since then than most men who stayed to fight. I see it in how you work this land, how you helped a stranger in need. And I see dignity in you," Caleb said quietly. "No matter what cruel words your stepfather spoke. Truth stands longer than slander, like I told you before." Sarah Beth's cheeks flushed pink in the firelight. She reached for the bread, and her fingers brushed his as she passed him a piece. The brief touch sent warmth through his weather-chilled. "Hands that hymn you sang," he said after a moment. "The one like my Elizabeth used to sing. I never thought to hear it again, at least not in these mountains. But he paused, searching for words. "It eased something in me I thought was past. Healing. Healing. Music can reach places words can't touch," Sarah Beth replied softly. "When I sing, I feel closer to my mother. Closer to God, too." She ducked her head shyly. "And here, in this cabin, it's the first time since she passed that I've felt truly safe, protected." The word hung in the air between them, delicate as the snowflakes drifting past the window. Caleb watched the firelight play across her features, seeing not the ruined woman of town gossip, but someone strong enough to rebuild. From ashes, someone who brought light back into his solitary world. They sat in companionable quiet watching the flames dance, while snow fell steadily outside. The tender understanding between them grew stronger with each peaceful moment, like a fragile seedling taking root in spring soil. Neither spoke of it directly. but both felt the subtle shift to wounded souls finding unexpected healing in each other's presence. The invitation arrived with the morning. Milk delivery, simple note from Martha Johnson, asking them to join. Her family's Christmas Eve gathering. Sarah Beth's eyes lit up as she read it aloud, though she tried to temper her excitement. "We need not go if you prefer quiet," she told Caleb, knowing his usual solitary ways. Caleb paused in his bootlacing, studying her hopeful expression. "Reckon some Christmas cheer might do us good," he said finally. Her answering smile warmed the whole kitchen. As dusk approached on Christmas Eve, they prepared for the ride into town. Sarah Beth had spent days mending her best dress, and now she wrapped herself in the thick wool coat Caleb had pulled from his old trunk. He watched her pin up her hair by the mirror, suddenly struck by how naturally she belonged in his home. Evening air bit sharp and clean as they hitched the wagon. Stars sparkled between ribbons of clouds, and their breath frosted in the lamplight. Sarah Beth sat close beside him on the wagon seat, sharing warmth through layers of blankets. The runners whispered over fresh snow as they made their way down. The mountain path light spilled from every window of the Johnsons' farmhouse, and fiddle music drifted out to greet them. Sarah Beth's grip tightened on Caleb's arm as they approached the door. "It will be fine," he murmured, and she straightened her shoulders. Martha Johnson welcomed them with genuine warmth, ushering them into the crowded parlor. "So glad you came. The children have been asking if Miss Ridge would sing carols, though some guests still whispered behind their hands. Most offered friendly nods. The atmosphere was festive oil lamps, glowing, pine boughs draped with paper chains, children darting between adult legs with cookies clutched in their fists. The fiddler struck up Silent Night, and several voices joined in. Sarah Beth found herself drawn to the group around the piano. When they began, "O Come All the Faithful," she added her clear soprano to the chorus. The room gradually quieted as her voice soared above the others, pure as an angel's. Even the children stopped their games to listen. "Heavenly," Martha whispered. "When the song ended, you must lead the next one." Caleb watched from his corner as Sarah Beth led carol after carol, her face glowing with joy. Something tight in his chest began to loosen. He had forgotten how it felt to be part of such gathering, to see happiness freely shared. "Good to see you here, Caleb," Tom Peterson said, offering him a cup of cider. "Been too long since you joined, U.S. Common Folk." "Been too long since I had reason to," Caleb admitted. "Miss Ridge has brought real light to that cabin of yours," Martha added, joining them. "You seem more alive these days." Caleb couldn't deny it. Watching Sarah Beth laugh with the other young women, he barely recognized himself as the same bitter recluse who had hidden away after Elizabeth's death. The music and warmth had thawed something frozen in him. As midnight approached, Martha called everyone outside to sing one final carol under the stars. Lanterns cast golden pools on the snow as they gathered in the yard. Sarah Beth found her way to Caleb's side as the first notes of Silent Night rose into the crystal-clear air. Her voice lifted sweet and true beside him. Caleb felt the harmony vibrate in his chest as he joined in, surprising himself by remembering the words. The lantern light caught in Sarah Beth's hair, turning it to spun gold. When she turned to smile up at him, his breath caught. The last note faded into the hushed night. Others began moving back inside, but Caleb and Sarah Beth lingered in there. Pool of lantern light. Snowflakes drifted between them, catching on her eyelashes. Her lips parted slightly as he leaned closer, drawn by something stronger than his own will. At the last moment, propriety reasserted itself. Caleb pulled back, though it took all his strength. Sarah Beth's eyes held understanding, mixed with something deeper that made his heart race. They stood suspended in that moment, both aware that something profound and inevitable had begun between them. The ride home passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft crunch of snow under the wagon wheels. Sarah Beth hummed carols, under her breath, her shoulder warm against Caleb's. The night sparkled around them, stars brilliant in the velvet sky, and snow diamond bright in the moonlight. Neither spoke of the Amesquis, yet joy hummed between them like a plucked string. As they crested the last rise toward home, Sarah Beth's hand found his beneath the blankets. Her fingers twined with his, a touch more intimate than any kiss could have been. The cabin waited ahead, windows glowing with welcome. For the first time in years, Caleb felt truly at peace with both past and present, and full of hope for what tomorrow might bring. The first morning of 1879 broke over the mountains in shafts of crystalline light. Sarah Beth stood at the cabin window, watching the sun sparkle across untouched snow. Behind her, Caleb gathered the deed papers into his leather satchel, his movements deliberate and careful. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, wrapping her mother's shawl tightly around her shoulders. The fabric still held traces of lavender, a comfort against what lay ahead. Together, they climbed into the wagon, the runners cutting clean tracks through the fresh powder as they descended toward town. The county office sat squat and official on Main Street, its brick facade stark against the white landscape. Sarah Beth's hands trembled as they climbed the wooden steps. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper, warm after the bitter cold. The clerk peered at them through wire-rimmed spectacles, his quill poised over a large ledger. Caleb placed Sarah Beth's deed on the desk. "We've come to register this land claim," he said, his voice steady. "It belonged to Margaret Ridge and now rightfully passes to her daughter." The clerk had just begun examining the document when the door burst open. Amos Ridge stumbled in, face flushed with whiskey despite the early hour. Behind him came the railroad surveyor, Julius Morton, and two well-dressed men Sarah Beth didn't recognize. "That paper's a forgery," Amos bellowed, jabbing a finger toward the deed. "My stepdaughter's been living in sin with this deserter, cooking up schemes." Sarah Beth felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true. It's my mother's deed to you." "No, it is." Morton stepped forward, all smooth confidence. "Mr. Ridge has already agreed to sell his family's claim to the Denver and Rio Grande. This supposed deed would interfere with contracted railway passages." The clerk looked uncertainly between them all. Sheriff Harlow appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. His deputy hovered behind him. "What's all this about?" the sheriff demanded. "Fraud," Morton said crisply. "This man and girl are attempting to block legitimate railroad business with falsified documents." He produced papers of his own. "We have witnesses who will swear this deed was created recently." "It wasn't," Sarah Beth cried. "Lone Hawk saw Mother. Sign it, he'll tell you." Amos sneered, a savage's word against proper businessmen. "Sheriff, surely you see what's happening here." Sheriff Harlow's face grew stern. "Caleb McCrae, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted fraud." He nodded to his deputy. "Take him to the jail." "No." Sarah Beth lunged forward as the deputy grabbed Caleb's arms. "You can't. He's done nothing wrong." Caleb didn't resist, but his eyes held deep pain as they fastened on hers. "Stay strong," he murmured. "The girl comes home with me," Amos declared, reaching for Sarah Beth's arm. "I'm still her legal guardian. I won't go." She twisted away, clinging to Caleb as the deputy tried to pull him toward the door. "Please, Sheriff Harlow, listen to me." But the sheriff's expression remained unmoved. "I'm sorry, Miss Ridge, but the law is clear. You're underage. You must return to your guardian's custody." Sarah Beth fought as Amos dragged her toward his waiting wagon, her screams drawing stares from townsfolk on the street. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes that caught in her hair and eyelashes, blinding her. Her swirling white, she glimpsed Caleb being led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Caleb," she cried one last time before Amos shoved her onto the wagon seat. Her throat was raw from screaming as they rattled away from town, leaving deep ruts in the fresh snow. In his cell that night, Caleb sat with his head in his hands. The only window showed darkness and falling snow, reminding him of the night Sarah Beth had first appeared at his door. Now she was back in her stepfather's cruel keeping, and he was powerless to help her. The cold seeped through the stone walls, but Caleb barely felt it. His thoughts circled endlessly if he hadn't deserted during the war. If he'd been a better man, perhaps God wouldn't be punishing them both now. He'd dared to hope for redemption, for happiness even. But his past sins had finally caught up with him, dooming not only himself, but the innocent woman who'd trusted him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying all traces of the tracks that had led Sarah Beth to his door that first desperate night. Caleb pressed his forehead against the icy bars and prayed, for the first time in years. For mercy, not for himself, but for her. The jail cell's iron bars cast long shadows in the dim lamplight. Caleb paced the small space, his boots scuffing. Against the rough wooden floor, 3 days had passed since his arrest, each hour dragging like a weight around his neck. The cell's single window offered a view of nothing but gray sky and falling snow. He paused his pacing when footsteps echoed down the corridor. Reverend Harlan appeared, Bible tucked under his arm, his stern face lined with disapproval. "Brother McCrae," the preacher said, standing rigid before the cell, "I've come to counsel you toward repentance." Caleb said nothing, just stared at the floor. "The Lord sees all deception," Reverend Harlan continued, "harboring a fallen woman, attempting fraud." These Sims cried out for confession. He gripped the bars with gloved hands. "Admit your wrongs, and perhaps mercy might be shown." "Sarah Beth is innocent," Caleb said quietly. "The deed is real." The Reverend's expression hardened. "Pride goes before destruction, Brother McCrae. First desertion. In the war, now this. How far are you fallen from grace?" Each word struck like a physical blow. Caleb turned away, unable to bear the judgment in the preacher's eyes. Behind him, Reverend Harlan sighed heavily. "I'll pray for your soul," he said. His footsteps retreated down the corridor, leaving Caleb alone with his shame as evening settled over the town. Tom Wheeler, the shopkeeper, appeared with Caleb's daily meal. The older man glanced nervously down the hall before slipping something through the bars, along with the tin plate. "From Miss Ridge," he whispered, "had to wait till the sheriff stepped out." Caleb's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, a page torn from a Bible, its edges ragged. His eyes found the verse Sarah Beth had marked. "The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He sank onto his thin cot, clutching the paper to his chest. All these years, he'd seen himself as that rejected stone, the deserter, the widow, the hermit. But perhaps God wasn't finished with him yet. Perhaps his broken life could still become something of worth. For the first time in days, he wept freely. Not tears of despair, but of release. The paper in his hands felt like a lifeline, proof that Sarah Beth still believed in him, still saw good where others saw only sin. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered into the growing darkness, "for not giving up on this old stone." Miles away, in Amos Ridge's cramped farmhouse, Sarah Beth huddled in her small room. Her stepfather's drunken voice carried through the thin walls as he ranted in the kitchen below. "Ungrateful girl." A bottle crashed against something solid. "After all I'd done for her." Sarah Beth pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the familiar tirade. She'd endured 3 days of the Sammis alternating between maudlin self-pity and raging accusations. The only comfort was knowing he was too drunk most nights to remember she existed. She pulled out her mother's worn prayer book, running her fingers over the empty space where she'd torn out the page for Caleb. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "let the verse give him strength, and please send Lone Hawk soon." She'd managed to get word to the Comanche trader through Tom Wheeler's wife, who did washing for families outside town. If Lone Hawk came to testify about the deed, she'd find a way to escape. She had to believe that. A particularly loud crash from below made her jump. Amos was working himself into one of his rages. "Sarah Beth," he bellowed up the stairs. "Get down here!" She held her breath, pressing against the door she'd barricaded with a chair. Her stepfather's heavy footsteps started up the stairs, then stumbled. There was a thud, followed by cursing. After a moment, she heard him drag himself back down to the kitchen. Sarah Beth exhaled slowly. Soon, he would drink himself to sleep. She just had to stay quiet, stay strong, and wait for her chance. Her fingers traced the worn cover of her mother's prayer book. "Watch over Caleb," she prayed softly. "Let him know he's not alone. Let him see that you can use even our broken pieces to build something beautiful." Outside her window, snow continued to fall in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in that white wilderness, she knew Lone Hawk was making his way toward town. She just had to hold on to hope for a little longer. In his cell, Caleb read the smuggled verse again by the fading light. The paper was already soft from handling, but the words remained clear. A rejected stone becoming the cornerstone, it seemed impossible. Yet wasn't that the very heart of grace? He tucked the precious page carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing that God could use even a deserter's shame for good. Sarah Beth had helped him see that truth. Now he had to be strong, enough to live it. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as hoofbeats echoed through the quiet streets of town. Heads turned as Lone Hawk rode in, his weathered face stern beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him came 3 more riders to Comanche traders and elderly Samuel Whitaker, a settler known for his honest dealings with both natives and townsfolk outside the courthouse. A crowd had already gathered for the hearing. Sheriff Harlow stood at the steps, watching warily as Lone Hawk dismounted with fluid grace. The Comanche's eyes swept the assembled faces, settling briefly on Sarah Beth, who stood trembling beside Amos Ridge. Inside the stuffy courtroom, Marshal Peterson sat behind a makeshift judge's desk, his expression carefully neutral as Lone Hawk stepped forward. The trader's moccasins made no sound on the wooden floor. "I witnessed Mary Ridge sign that deed," Lone Hawk stated, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "It was during the spring trading season. 7 years past, she transferred the land rights to her daughter, Sarah Beth, in the presence of myself and others." Samuel Whitaker stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "That's right," the old settler added. "I was there too. Mary wanted to make sure her girl would always have a place to call home, no matter what came." The marshal studied the deed Sarah Beth had presented, comparing it to other documents. The room held its breath. Even the usual whispers fell silent. "The paper and ink are consistent with documents from that time," Marshal Peterson announced. "Slowly, and the witnesses are credible." He looked up, meeting Sarah Beth's tear-filled eyes. "I have no choice but to declare this deed valid and binding." A gasp went through the crowd. Amos Ridge's face turned purple with rage. "You can't!" he shouted, surging to his feet. "I already sold those rights to the railroad. Took their money 3 months ago." His words slurred with drink and fury. The room erupted. Townsfolk who had been suspicious of Amos's sudden wealth began shouting accusations. "Thief!" someone called out. "Swindler! You sold land that wasn't yours to sell," Marshal Peterson demanded, rising from his seat. Amos realized too late what he had admitted. He backed toward the door, but angry citizens blocked his path. "And you slandered that poor girl to cover your theft." Mrs. Wheeler cried from the gallery. Others took up the cry, pressing forward. "Order!" Sheriff Harlow bellowed, moving to prevent violence. "Stand back." The marshal's gavel cracked against wood. "In light of this confession, I order Caleb McCrae released immediately." He fixed Amos with a hard stare. "And I strongly suggest you leave town, Mr. Ridge, before formal charges are filed." Deputy Turner hurried to the jail, while Sheriff Harlow and his men held back the angry crowd. Amos Ridge, his face now ashen, slipped out a side door. Through the windows, people could see him scrambling onto his horse, spurring it hard toward the railroad camp. The main doors opened. Caleb walked in, still wearing his prison clothes, squinting in the bright room. Sarah Beth broke free from the crowd with a cry. Running to him, he caught her in his arms as she wept against his chest. "The deed is valid," she managed between sobs. "Lone Hawk," came, "we won." Caleb looked over her head at the Comanche trader, who gave him a slight nod. "Thank you," Caleb said hoarsely, "for speaking truth." "A promise is a promise," Lone Hawk replied. "Simply, your land is safe now." The railroad surveyor Julius Morton and his men slipped away during the commotion, their plans for the valley now worthless without Amos's false claim. The townsfolk surrounded Caleb and Sarah Beth, offering apologies and congratulations. Marshal Peterson approached them, holding out the deed. "This is yours now, Miss Ridge," he said formally, "along with my apologies for any injustice done." "Sarah?" Beth took the paper with trembling hands. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes shining. "Our land is safe," she whispered. "Both our homes." Caleb's arms tightened around her, his heart too full for words. Through the courthouse windows, sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, promising a clean start. Justice had come at last, carried on. The word of a Comanche trader who valued truth above profit, and the courage of a young woman who refused to let shame steal her. Birthright, Sheriff Harlow, helped clear a path through the celebrating crowd. Together, Caleb and Sarah Beth walked out into the bright winter morning. Free at last from shadows of the past, sunlight streamed through the church's small windows, casting rainbow patterns through colored glass onto the wooden pews. The chapel buzzed with whispered conversations as townsfolk filed in for Sunday service. Sarah Beth's hand trembled in Caleb's as they approached the church steps. "You sure about this?" she whispered, hesitating at the door. Caleb squeezed her hand gently, more sure than I've been about anything since the war. They entered together, their boots echoing on the plank floor. Heads turned, but the usual harsh whispers were replaced with softer, wondering murmurs. News of Amos Ridge's disgrace and hasty departure had spread quickly through the mountain community near the back. Lone Hawk stood quietly, his presence unusual in the White Settlers' Church. He nodded once to Caleb, his dark eyes holding wisdom and approval. Reverend Harlan cleared his throat from the pulpit, preparing to begin the service. But Caleb released Sarah Beth's hand and strode forward, his voice carrying clear and strong. Through the hushed sanctuary, "Begging your pardon, Reverend, but I have something to say." He turned to face the congregation. "You all know Sarah Beth Ridge. You've heard tales about her, spread by a man who sought to steal her birthright. Sir." Beth's eyes filled with tears as she whispered the words that had haunted her for so long. "She's pure. I'm ruined." Caleb reached for her hand, drawing her forward. "No," he declared firmly. "Both are perfect in God's eyes and in mine." He faced the congregation unflinching. "This woman has shown more courage and faith than any I've known. She is no fallen woman, but a child of God, worthy of respect." A murmur of approval rippled through the pews. Mrs. Wheeler dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Several others nodded, remembering Sarah Beth's hymns that had moved their hearts. "Well then, Reverend," Harlan said, his stern face softening into a smile, "it seems God has led us to a moment of blessing." He raised his hands over Caleb and Sarah Beth. "Let all witness that these two souls, refined by trial and proven faithful, have found His grace together." The congregation broke into spontaneous cheers and amens. From his place at the back, Lone Hawk's solemn nod carried the weight of justice restored. Of truth prevailing over lies, evening painted the mountain peaks in purple and gold as Caleb and Sarah Beth made their way along the snowy trail toward home. Their boots crunched rhythmically through fresh powder, matching the peaceful beating of their hearts. Neighbors called out warm greetings from their porches as the pair passed. A far cry from the suspicious glances of weeks before, sure is different. "Now," Sarah Beth said softly, adjusting her shawl against the chill. Caleb nodded, taking in the valley that stretched before them. No railroad stakes marked the land, no surveyors' flags threatened their peace. Lamplight glowed from cabin windows across the settlement, each one a testament to homes and hopes preserved. Inside their own cabin, Sarah Beth stirred a pot of beans. Hanging over the hearth, the same simple meal she'd shared with Caleb that first desperate night. But now her movements were sure, comfortable, and laughter brightened her eyes as she worked. "Reminds me of when you first came," Caleb said, watching her from his chair. "Though reckon we've both changed since then." "For the better," Sarah Beth replied, her voice warm with certainty. Caleb rose slowly, his hand moving to his pocket. Taking a deep breath, he crossed to where she stood and lowered himself to one knee. "Sarah Beth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." Outside, unseen in the gathering dusk, Lone Hawk watched the cabin for a moment before turning his horse toward the mountains. His work as witness to truth was done. A slight smile touched his lips as he rode away, satisfied that justice had prevailed. In the doorway of their cabin, Caleb and Sarah Beth stood hand in hand, their figures silhouetted by golden lamplight spilling out across the snow. Two souls once broken, now made whole through faith, love, and the healing power of second chances. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.